Introduction. Revisiting freedom and tyranny in America's story. In American history, the fight against slavery is often told as a simple story: freedom versus slavery. But what if it was more complicated? Noam Chomsky, a linguist and historian, says the Civil War wasn't just about ending slavery. He says it was also a fight between two ways of making money. The North, with its factories, wanted to stop slave labor and replace it with wage labor, where people work for pay. This makes us ask, what does freedom really mean in U.S. history? Was ending slavery the end of forced labor? Or did it just lead to a new kind of control, called wage slavery? To understand this, we need to look at a few big ideas. Enlightenment thinkers believed people had natural rights. They also didn't trust big companies. Abraham Lincoln and early Republicans were against wage slavery, even while fighting real slavery. In the late 1800s, people like Eugene Debs and Henry David Thoreau spoke out against unfair work and called for justice. Some also believed in anarchism, a way of living without rulers, where people make decisions together. We'll hear from these people in their own words, like Lincoln saying, "Labor is the superior of capital," and Thoreau saying, "The best government is that which governs not at all." The goal is to see history honestly, but with hope. Today's issues, low pay, big business power, and unfair systems, are not new. They're part of a long story of trying to make freedom and equality real for everyone. America's founders wanted a country where people were free, but they also left behind big problems that still matter today. Can a country really be democratic if giant companies have as much power as kings? And is a poor worker truly free just because he's not called a slave? People asked these same questions in the 1700s and 1800s, and they still feel relevant now. By looking at the old debates about ending slavery, the start of wage labor, and the growth of big business, we can better understand today's world. Many thinkers from the Enlightenment in the 1800s would likely be shocked by how unfair things are now, and how much power big companies have, but their ideas point to other ways of living, fairer systems, and even bold ideas for a world without bosses or oppression. These ideas aren't wild dreams. They're based on real American beliefs, like democracy and respect for each person. So, let's take a look at the journey from the Civil War to the words of people who fought for justice, like abolitionists and socialists. Along the way, we'll learn how wage slavery became a powerful phrase people used to speak out, how some fought against the idea that big companies should have the same rights as people, and how anarchism, often seen the wrong way, gives us a new way to think about what real freedom could look like. This story isn't always easy. It can be tough and sometimes sad, but it's also full of hope. It shows that the fight for freedom didn't stop when slavery ended. It kept going every time someone said that no person, whether a king, a boss, or someone in charge, has the right to treat others like they don't matter. This is the story of a revolution that still isn't finished. It's told by voices from the past and today, and it helps us think about what kind of future we want to build. Free labor versus slave labor. Chomsky's take on the Civil War. No event is more important in American history than the Civil War, which ended slavery. But Noam Chomsky wants us to think about another part of that war, a fight over what kind of work system would control the country. The South used slave labor. People were treated like property. The North said it stood for free labor, where people got paid for their work. But Chomsky says that many people back then thought wage labor wasn't that different from slavery. The Republican Party during Abraham Lincoln's time didn't ignore this idea. In fact, they were against both slavery and something they called wage slavery. Chomsky explains it like this. The Republican Party around 1870 said, "We're the party that's against slavery and against wage slavery." And this wasn't some extreme group, it was the main party. That might sound surprising today because we don't hear much about wage slavery in modern politics. But back in Lincoln's time, many people believed that being stuck in low-paying jobs for life wasn't real freedom either. What did wage slavery mean to people in the 1800s? It mostly meant being in a situation where someone didn't own land or a business and had to work for someone else just to survive. In other words, they were hired workers. For many people in early America, this was only okay if it was a short-term thing. A free person, they believed, might start out working for wages, but the goal was to one day own a farm or a shop. Staying a wage worker forever was seen as a problem. It meant not having control over your own life, and to many, that felt too close to real slavery. One historian points out that even Thomas Jefferson believed this. He thought real freedom meant owning the tools or land you worked with. He warned that working for someone else your whole life was a weaker kind of freedom, something like wage slavery. In Jefferson's dream for America, regular people, like small farmers and craftsmen, would not have to depend on someone else's money just to get by. By the middle of the 1800s, Jefferson's dream was running into a new reality. Factories and wage jobs were spreading fast, especially in the North. Some people, like labor leaders and a few politicians, were worried. They thought these new jobs were replacing the old idea of free labor, where workers could hope to be their own boss one day. They warned about a growing group of people stuck working for wages with no real chance to become independent. Abraham Lincoln and the early Republican Party took part in this debate. They supported free labor, not just in the sense of not being slaves, but in the sense of being self-employed. Lincoln's fight against slavery was based on the idea that workers should have a chance to move up in life by working hard. He didn't believe wage labor was always fair. He didn't think working for wages automatically made someone free. As philosopher Michael Sandel explains, Lincoln believed free labor was better than slave labor because the wage worker had hope. A slave had no chance to change their life, but a wage worker in the North could hope to one day own land or a business and work for themselves. Lincoln thought this chance to rise, the hope for independence, was what made the North's system better than slavery. Lincoln shared his ideas in a way that regular farmers and workers could understand and support. When Southern slave owners said Northern workers were just like slaves, Lincoln pushed back. He said that in the North there wasn't a fixed class of people stuck in labor jobs forever. He explained it like this: the man who worked for someone else last year, this year works for himself. Next year, he might even hire someone to work for him. In Lincoln's view, a worker could move up in life. Someone who worked for wages today might become a farmer or start a small business, and maybe even become an employer one day. Lincoln pictured a country where most people owned land or tools and worked for themselves, on farms, in shops, or in their homes. They didn't need help from rich investors or rely on the work of others, like slaves or hired hands. He knew not everyone would stop working for wages, and some would always be hired workers. But he thought that was something that could change, not a forever situation. As philosopher Michael Sandel points out, Lincoln didn't say that lifelong wage work was fine. Instead, he didn't think it would happen often in the North. Lincoln believed that both slavery and a permanent wage-working class were wrong because they placed labor below money. In an 1861 message to Congress during the Civil War, he said it clearly: labor is before and above capital. Capital comes from labor. Labor is more important than capital and should be respected more. When he said labor is the superior of capital, he was calling out those who treated workers like tools for the rich. His words summed up the belief that real work, not money, was what built the country and that workers deserved respect and fair rewards. With these beliefs, it's not surprising that the Republican Party in the 1860s saw itself fighting two big battles: ending slavery and stopping Northern workers from falling into wage slavery. Chomsky explains the thinking of that time like this: renting yourself out isn't much different from slavery. It's only okay if it leads to real free labor, but by itself, it's not acceptable. Northern newspapers agreed. In 1869, just a few years after the Civil War, the New York Times warned that factories were growing fast and forcing more small business owners to become employees. Big factories were replacing small workshops. The paper said that this change was creating a kind of slavery, just as harsh, if not as shameful, as what had existed in the South. This wasn't some small paper. It was one of the biggest in the country, and it was comparing new factory jobs to slavery just 4 years after slavery ended. The 1870 U.S. Census was replacing free labor. Pick this up. Even though America talked about free labor, it was quickly becoming a country full of employees. Many workers already saw this happening. As early as the 1830s, one labor activist warned that wage labor by the late 1850s. Lincoln and the Republicans were saying the same thing, trying to protect the Northern way of life. But here's the twist: the Civil War, which Lincoln fought in the name of free labor, also helped speed up the growth of big business and permanent wage jobs. As one writer said, beating the South got rid of the threat from slavery, but it brought back and even grew the threat from wage labor and factory life. The North won, and the country moved toward modern capitalism. But that shift brought new struggles between workers and owners. People who had been enslaved were glad when slavery ended, but they also saw right away that freedom without money or land was not enough. Frederick Douglass, a famous speaker and former slave, saw how many freed black people in the South ended up working as wage laborers or sharecroppers in very hard conditions. In 1883, Douglass said that wage slavery could be almost as painful and harmful as real slavery. He said this kind of wage slavery had to end too. Douglas pointed out that some people were already saying that freed black people were worse off than before. Many were poor, hungry, and without homes or proper clothes. Some critics cruelly joked that black people were now worse masters to themselves than their former owners had been. Douglas wasn't saying that slavery should have continued. He believed ending it was right. But he wanted people to understand that the fight wasn't over. Just because slavery was gone didn't mean true freedom had been won. He said that real freedom also means having fair work, good pay, and the chance to live with dignity. Being stuck in debt, paid unfairly, or forced to work under bad conditions could still crush people. He believed the fight for freedom had to go on until no one was treated like a beast of burden. It's interesting that even some people who supported slavery admitted it was similar to how badly workers were treated in the North, but they used that idea to defend slavery, not attack it. George Fitzhugh, a major pro-slavery writer from the South, said in 1849 that factory jobs in the North were worse than slavery. He argued that at least a slave was treated like valuable property. A slave owner, he claimed, had a reason to care for the slave, like someone caring for a prized horse. But Northern bosses didn't care about their workers at all. Fitzhugh described free workers in a very harsh way. He said they made everything but got nothing in return. He called them the muzzled ox that treadeth out the straw. He said they were always fighting with their bosses for better pay, and with each other, trying to get jobs by working for less. He said this fight never stopped and usually ended with workers starving, going to poorhouses, jails, or even dying. Fitzhugh claimed that wage labor was worse than slavery. Of course, Fitzhugh wasn't being kind. He was trying to make slavery sound better by making Northern jobs sound terrible. He wanted people to believe it was better to be owned by a nice master than to be crushed by a harsh job market. We don't have to agree with his awful view to see the small truth in what he said. Factory jobs in the 1800s often treated workers like tools, not people, and left them poor and hopeless. Northern workers knew this too. They didn't want to go back to slavery, they wanted better lives. In Massachusetts, the Lowell Mill girls, young women working in textile mills, spoke out in the 1840s. They worked long hours for little pay and said it felt like servitude. They called the factory bell the drone of the hive and stood up for their worth. Voices like theirs, and people like Douglas and labor leaders, kept the idea alive that real freedom wasn't just about breaking chains. It was about having choices, fair pay, and control over your own life. By the 1870s, the Northern idea of free labor was starting to fall apart because of the rise of big industry. Horace Greeley, a well-known Republican newspaper editor, was upset that the Civil War's hope for a fairer society had stalled. The North had fought, in part, to protect small farmers and workers from being crushed by slave labor, and it won. But now, wage labor was becoming a new threat to the freedom of everyday people. Even the New York Times, which was not a radical paper, spoke out against wage labor during the 1870s. Chomsky points out that the Republican Party, which had started by fighting against slavery, was still speaking out against wage slavery. A common idea back then, Chomsky says, was that working for someone else for life was not very different from slavery. And this wasn't seen as a strange opinion. It was what Lincoln and many Republicans believed. Back in the 1800s, lots of Americans, like farmers, factory workers, and thinkers, believed that workers should be in charge of their own labor. Many thought that the people who worked in mills should also own them. The big goal was for workers to become their own bosses, not to stay stuck working for rich business owners. This idea wasn't seen as a dream or something unrealistic. It came from the values of the American Revolution and the belief that people should be independent and self-reliant. To sum it up, Chomsky's point about the Civil War time shows something important. The fight over slavery was also a fight about what freedom and work should really mean. When the North won, it ended chattel slavery, where people were treated as property. But that didn't end the problems with unfair labor. Instead, it opened the door to a new system where people who were now free could still be trapped by poverty, debt, and money troubles. People back then understood this. Many said that being free had to mean more than just not being called a slave. Real freedom meant not being controlled by hunger or having to depend on others just to live. The people in Lincoln's time didn't solve this problem completely. They ended one kind of slavery by freeing about 4 million people and stopping slavery from spreading. But another kind of struggle was just beginning, in the growing factories and railroad companies. This set the stage for what came next, a period known as the Gilded Age, where rich business leaders, sometimes called robber barons, clashed with workers and unions who were fighting for better pay and fair treatment. Before we look at those later battles, let's go back to the beginning. What ideas about rights and power shaped how early Americans thought about freedom? To understand that, we need to look at Enlightenment thinking, the beliefs that helped start the American Revolution and shaped the early U.S. government. The idea that wage slavery was something bad didn't just come out of nowhere. It was closely tied to Enlightenment values like personal freedom, fairness, and the belief that too much power in one place is dangerous. Enlightenment ideals, individuals, inherent rights, and the distrust of corporate power. The United States was created during the Age of Enlightenment, a time when many thinkers believed that every person is born with basic rights, like life, liberty, and the chance to be happy or own property, just because they are human. These thinkers said that government should only exist to protect those rights, and that their power should come from the people they govern. This idea is clearly stated in the Declaration of Independence, which was strongly shaped by the ideas of English philosopher John Locke. Enlightenment thinkers like Locke, Thomas Paine, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Voltaire believed in the worth and reasoning power of each person. They stood against the old system of kings, rich nobles, and powerful churches. They didn't trust any leader or group that wasn't directly responsible to the people. One thing Enlightenment thinkers did not believe had natural rights was the corporation. In the 1700s, a corporation was usually a group, like a trade company or a city government, set up by the state to do a specific job. Corporations weren't seen as real people. They were made up by law, not born with rights. No Enlightenment writer argued that corporations had natural rights, because the idea would have sounded silly. Rights were for real people, and to thinkers like Locke or Paine, that meant individual human beings. The U.S. Constitution, written by leaders influenced by Enlightenment ideas, doesn't mention corporations at all. In the early days of America, states kept tight control over corporations. They only gave charters for a short time, didn't let corporations own other companies, and banned them from getting involved in politics. A corporation wasn't seen as having a voice or a conscience. It was just a tool created by people, and it could only exist with public approval. Noam Chomsky explains how people used to see corporations. Think about what corporations were like in the mid-1800s and earlier. A corporation was just a partnership, an artificial thing. The people in the partnership had rights. The corporation itself did not. It was created to do one job, like build a bridge. That's it. That's what a corporation was. In other words, corporations were tools to do certain tasks. They were not seen as people with their own rights. Enlightenment thinkers would have thought giving human rights to something that isn't alive and can't think or feel is risky. A corporation can't make moral choices and isn't punished the same way a person can be. As Chomsky puts it, rights are natural rights. They come from being a person, not from being a big, powerful company. Corporations don't have rights. So saying a corporation has the right to free speech or can spend money on elections like a real citizen wouldn't have made sense back then. At best, it would have sounded silly, and at worst, like a legal trick. The founders of the United States were worried that big private powers could become a threat to freedom. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, strongly disliked banks and big companies. In 1816, he wrote a letter warning about a growing danger. "I hope we crush in its birth the aristocracy of our moneyed corporations, which dare already to challenge our government to a trial of strength." Jefferson was saying that rich corporations were starting to act like kings or nobles, trying to overpower the government. In his time, these were mostly banks or businesses given special power by the state. He feared they could get so rich and powerful that they would try to control the country. He saw this as a new kind of aristocracy, not based on birth or titles, but on money, and he wanted to stop it early. From how he talked, it's clear that Jefferson would have been shocked by today's idea of corporate personhood, treating companies like people under the law. To him, big corporations were dangerous. They were outside the control of regular people and could take over if not watched closely. Jefferson and others from his time believed that real democracy couldn't survive if powerful groups acted without answering to the people. They believed that the only true power should come from the citizens themselves. Enlightenment thinking also believed in equality under the law. This didn't fully include women, enslaved people, or poor men in the 1700s, but it was still an important goal. By the 1800s, voting rights and civil rights had grown in America, at least for white men, and most people agreed that no one should have special rights just because of their family name. A corporation was seen as a special privilege given by the government. It was allowed to exist, own property as a group, and protect its owners from some legal problems. Early Americans thought these privileges should be carefully watched. Corporations were usually created for big projects like building canals, railroads, or running banks. If they broke rules or used their power unfairly, the government could take away their charter. Even before the Revolution, Americans were suspicious of powerful companies. The Boston Tea Party was partly a protest against the British East India Company, a giant business that had special rights from the king. The colonists felt it was being treated too well and hurting local merchants. So, in a way, America's fight for freedom also included a dislike of big corporations right from the start. The classical Enlightenment idea was that each person has rights and deserves respect, and that big institutions should serve the people, not control them. A corporation wasn't seen as a real person. It had no soul, and unlike people, it wasn't made in God's image, as people often said back then. Letting a corporation have the same rights as real citizens in a democracy was seen as dangerous. It could lead to a new kind of unfair rule, like kings or nobles hiding behind legal rules. Chomsky makes a strong comparison. I don't think corporations should exist any more than fascism should exist. They are similar totalitarian institutions, created in the late 1800s and brought into American law. The traditional view is that only people have rights. The state has no rights. His words are bold. He compares corporations to dictatorships. But the basic point comes from Enlightenment thinking. Back then, kings said they had a divine right to rule. But Enlightenment leaders like Jefferson and Paine said no one, and no group, has the right to rule others without their okay. Only people have real rights, and all people have those rights equally. Any group, whether it's a church, a king, or a business, that takes away people's rights is not legitimate, unless it's strictly limited by laws and truly serves the public good. It's important to know that even Adam Smith, who is often seen as the father of free market capitalism, didn't fully trust powerful corporations. In his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, 1776, Smith criticized the big companies of his time, like the East India Company. He pointed out that when managers are in charge of other people's money instead of their own, they often waste it or use it badly to help themselves. Smith wrote, "The directors of such companies, being the managers rather of other people's money than of their own, it cannot well be expected that they should watch over it with the same anxious vigilance." In other words, people don't take care of money as carefully when it doesn't belong to them. He believed these companies were often careless and full of corruption because the owners weren't the same people running things. Smith also gave a strong warning about the masters of mankind, his name for rich merchants and business owners. He said they always try to get what they want, no matter who gets hurt, following what he called their selfish rule. All for ourselves, and nothing for other people. That's a very tough statement coming from someone who supported capitalism, but Smith understood that people with great wealth often think only of themselves and not the good of everyone else. Even though Smith supported free markets, he believed they should include fair rules and real competition. He didn't support monopolies or giant companies running everything without limits. He lived before modern corporations really took off, but his writings clearly show that he worried about what could happen if economic power became too concentrated and stopped serving the public good. Enlightenment thinkers like Thomas Paine took the idea of fairness even further by thinking about economic justice, not just political freedom. Paine, a strong supporter of both the American and French revolutions, believed that having equal rights under the law wasn't enough if huge differences in wealth still existed. In 1797, he wrote a piece called Agrarian Justice, where he suggested something like today's basic income or Social Security. He wanted this to be paid for by a tax on landowners. Paine said that land has value because of the whole community, not just the person who owns it. So he believed that landowners owed something back to society, a kind of rent to help people who didn't own land. Every proprietor owes to the community a ground rent for the land which he holds, he wrote. Paine wasn't trying to take away all private property, but he did want to stop poverty by giving every young adult a one-time payment and older people a regular income, paid for through higher taxes on the wealthy. His goal was fairness and dignity for everyone. Paine wrote, "I care not how affluent some may be, provided that none be miserable in consequence of it." That line shows the Enlightenment idea of balancing personal freedom with justice for all. Paine wasn't against wealth itself, but he believed it was wrong when one person's riches came at the cost of someone else's suffering. He even compared a society with extreme rich and poor to dead and living bodies chained together. A shocking image that shows how this hurts everyone, including the rich. Paine believed that a good society makes sure no one is left in misery. It's important to see that this early American revolutionary was already calling for something like today's safety net. He understood that real freedom means more than just legal rights. It also means having the basic things you need to live. If someone is always hungry or homeless, they aren't truly free, no matter what the law says. So, how does all of this connect to corporations and democracy? By the late 1800s, long after Jefferson and Paine, huge industrial companies had taken over, like railroads, oil companies, and steel companies. Around that time, a new legal idea started to grow: corporate personhood. Court cases, especially the 1886 Santa Clara County v. Southern Pacific Railroad case, began to treat corporations as if they were people under the law. Judges said corporations had some of the same rights as real people, like the right not to have their property taken away without fair legal steps. Over time, corporations were given even more rights. They were allowed to spend money on politics as if that were free speech. They were also given the right to advertise under commercial speech. This would have shocked Enlightenment thinkers. To them, the idea that something made by humans, a company, could have more power than a real person would have seemed completely backward. The warning Jefferson gave about the aristocracy of moneyed corporations had come true. These big companies weren't just challenging the government, they were starting to control it. The very thing the founders feared most had become real: private power taking over public life. A clear example of how corporate power clashed with democracy happened in the late 1800s and early 1900s, during the rise of the trusts and the antitrust movement. Huge companies called trusts, like Standard Oil and U.S. Steel, took control of entire industries. They used their power to influence lawmakers and crush smaller businesses that tried to compete. In response, reformers pushed back. They used the same ideas from the Enlightenment, warning that a few rich and powerful people were taking away the rights of everyone else. Even President Theodore Roosevelt, who believed in capitalism, spoke out against the worst corporations. He called them malefactors of great wealth and took them to court. He wanted to break them up because he feared that if a few companies got too much power, it would hurt democracy and give private interests control over public life. You could say that during the Gilded Age, America faced an old struggle in a new form: the fight between democracy and rule by the few. But this time, the powerful few weren't kings or nobles. They were rich business owners, sometimes called corporate barons. Critics of these big companies used Enlightenment ideas to push back. They believed that made-up legal groups like corporations should not have the same rights as real people. Letting them spend tons of money to sway elections, for example, would hurt democracy. These critics believed that corporations, if not controlled, were a threat to democracy. That's because most companies are set up like pyramids. Power flows from the top down. CEOs and board members make the decisions, not the workers. Noam Chomsky has said that corporations are totalitarian institutions on the inside. They don't work like a democracy, and that's a problem when they grow powerful in the outside world too. People have warned about this danger for a long time. In the 1930s, Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis said, "We can have democracy, or we can have great concentrated wealth in the hands of a few, but we cannot have both." In 1961, President Dwight Eisenhower warned Americans to be careful of the military-industrial complex, a tight relationship between the government and big companies in defense. These warnings all come back to a basic Enlightenment idea: freedom can't survive if too much power is held by one group, whether it's a government or a giant business. To sum it up, Enlightenment thinkers believed that the individual citizen was the true holder of rights and power. Big groups, like corporations, were supposed to be tools to help society, not powerful forces that could work against it. In their view, giving human rights to a company would have seemed like a mistake, or even a legal trick to let the rich act like a new kind of royalty. In fact, what Thomas Jefferson feared most, corporations becoming so strong they could challenge or control the government, is close to what many Americans worry about today. With corporate lobbying and huge political donations, people fear that money now has more power than voters. The writers of the Constitution didn't predict everything. They probably didn't imagine companies claiming free speech rights to influence elections. But their core ideas gave future generations a way to question and push back against those changes. Next, we'll look at how later thinkers in the 1800s responded to the rise of big business and corporate power. But first, let's try a thought experiment. What would Enlightenment thinkers like Jefferson, Paine, or Locke think of today's world, with giant companies, big money in politics, and deep gaps between rich and poor? Thinking about that helps us connect the past to today and see how these old ideas still matter.